It's a great pleasure to be here at this extraordinary event. I think Michael's entire life has been a lesson. Anyone exposed to him or to his work is ipso facto his student. I know that I've been his student for the, I guess, close to 40 of those 50 years that I've known him. But of course, many people have been his students in a much more literal sense. And while Michael's influence has been enormous in architecture, in drawing, in painting, in products, we now see in healthcare, and also in that delicate, nebulous, hard to understand place in between the profession and the public, a place where he's built a bridge that's very much his own. On top of all of that, or preceding all of that, or continuing parallel to all of that, has been Michael's influence in the studio and in the classroom. I think there have been few more influential architectural educators in our time or in any other. So for the next hour, hour and a half, we'll talk about that influence and what it's meant for the profession, what it's been like, and what it will mean for the future. So if I can please invite the panel to join me on the podium, Monica Ponce de Leon, David Mohney, Anthony Vidler, and Peter Eisenman. If I can start by asking you to kind of set the scene in Princeton back in the 1960s when Bob Geddes was the dean. All these new people come into a place that probably Jean Labatut had been the most important, most influential voice until then. He brought forth talents like Venturi, Charles Moore, Hugh Hardy, and so forth. And then it began to change very dramatically. Peter, you were very much in the middle of that and involved in bringing Tony, among others. Can you talk a little bit about that time and set the scene, as it were, and with Michael then as critical to it?
Well, it goes back before Bob Geddes. That's
Okay.
an important
Okay.
issue. It goes back to Michael. We knew each other. We knew each other in Cambridge in '59. Michael was working at Carl Koch, and I was working at TAC. Michael then won the Prix de Rome. He went to Rome, and he was working in the TAC office. I was traveling in '61 with Colin Rowe, and we, because of the people I knew, we went into the TAC office, and of course Michael was there, and we re-engaged. I had no idea that Michael was going to Princeton. He got to Princeton in '62. I interviewed for a job in '62, and then arrived in '63, and Michael and I immediately became sort of outliers in the school, as it were. But for some reason, we also were able to have direct access to the president, Robert Goheen, at that time, which is totally unheard of, that two young assistant professors could go and see Goheen. And of course, we were pretty brash, and we asked Goheen.
As opposed to now, you mean?
As opposed to now.
Okay.
Yeah, as opposed to now. We've settled down. We first asked him for money for a group called the Case Group, which involved all the young people, plus Vince Scully and Colin Rowe. And there were, I think, 10 of those meetings eventually that took place. And then we got an idea, a crazy idea, that we wanted to do a linear city project, which Francisco was showing. And we went to Goheen. Not only had he given us money for the Case Group, so he said, "How much do you want?" We said $100,000. Well, $100,000 in 1963 or 4 was, millions.
Asking for several $1 million.
Yeah,
Right,
several
right,
million
yeah.
dollars and two punk kids. And Goheen said, "Here's 35, go get the rest." And he organized it so that we got the rest. And so what we just did was bring over a whole raft of Englishmen, one of them, Tony Erdley, and we set up a kind of para school in the basement of Princeton. And that's how we got to do the New City show with Arthur Drexler. And, you know, went from there. It was a very heady time. And as I said last night, Michael and I used to do competition. I think we did 3 competitions and 2 projects together, unlikely as it may seem looking back, but we would draw on the same sheet of paper. I mean, you know, he would be over there, I'd be here. I think he could draw upside down, I couldn't, so I had to have the plan in front of me. We disagree about, you know, who could do what, but I still think I do classical plans better than Michael, but this, but he'll talk about, we'll talk about that later. So it was an amazing moment. Impossible to happen again, right, no matter where, in any institution, that the president would be giving that kind of money to unproven people. And it was a heady time between 62 when Michael got there through, I would say, to Strada Novissima in 80, Portland Building 82. I would say those 20 years were as important in architecture in the world as any before and since. And I think Michael was certainly rose to the top of that moment. I mean, in 1980, I would argue Michael Graves was what Le Corbusier was 20 years or so before, and what supposedly I think Rem Koolhaas supposedly thinks he is today. Sorry.
No. You're not going to do better than that line. Tony, do you want to comment on?
Well, yes, I go back because Peter and I were freshmen at Cambridge in 1960. He is a PhD student. I as a beginning undergraduate, and he took over the first year studio from Sandy Wilson, who was visiting Yale, and so he becomes my first design teacher. And of course, he taught me how to do Japanese shoji screens because he'd just come back from Japan and loved the idea of wood detailing. So I owe my talent in wood detailing to Peter Eisenman, which is not evident in later developments. But I have to say that when introduced to the basement in Princeton on graduation from Cambridge, half as an instructor and half as a sort of indentured draftsperson for Linear City projects, it started me on 2 things. One, it started me on history because they asked me to do the history of the Linear City, which I developed and it later became major pieces that I published, but also because in teaching studio at Princeton, and that I think goes on throughout my entire time at Princeton and Michael's time at Princeton, the extraordinary relationship that could exist between studio teaching, history, and theory, and the extraordinary ability that Michael had, not only generosity in terms of both tolerating and even arguing about different positions in architecture. A young, brash, modernist leftist like myself, and Michael, who deeply steeped in Rome and the whole tradition of classical architecture, but also the ability that Michael had to teach studio in such a way that students were deeply concerned with history and theory throughout my time there. And I have to say that it not only did the school an enormous amount of good, but it basically allowed me to develop my whole career. And for that, I'm so deeply grateful to Michael. Thank you.
That's a way of casting Michael's pedagogy and also, in a way, his career as more continuous than it is sometimes thought of in terms of the sort of traditional epiphany. You're saying, in fact, that history was always critical to the way he was teaching, the way he was looking at things and the way he was conveying them to students from the beginning.
Precedent, the notion of precedent, which goes back to something that I think we'll be talking about, which is to do with drawing. One of the things that Colin Rowe always used to do was, in terms of his studio teaching, was to insist that you had a roll of yellow tracing paper on your desk and it'd be full before he came to the desk, and it would be empty the half hour or the 3/4 of an hour after he left, and you would have a pile of very thick pencil wobbly drawings which overlaid with precedents that he was drawing from in his mind, and plans and sections and elevations that sometimes expanded to whole sites and came back. And Michael had that incredible ability to draw architecture in a way that was abstract enough for history to be active, for all precedent to be active and incorporated and beautifully produced without imitation. With a sense of the past and a sense of active present.
Which is, I think, what one feels in his architecture as well, and all of his drawing, not just pedagogy. Can we talk a little bit more, in fact, about studio style, so to speak? Monica, can you or David sort of add a little to the whole sense of what Michael brought to the studio and how it redefined the studio?
So I was not educated at Princeton, so it's a little unusual that I'm in this panel. But at the same time, I'm very excited that I'm in the panel, because the first book I ever received in architecture was actually a gift from my mother, and it was Michael Graves' monograph. And I got it from my mother in my first week of architecture school at the University of Miami as an undergraduate. So I learned to draw by looking at Michael's drawings. So I learned to draw plans, I learned to draw elevations. The centrality of drawing in the training of architects in the last 50 years has been extremely important. And I'm sure we're going to talk about drawing in terms of the future of pedagogy. But I think that's one of the ways in which Michael's influence in academia really spread throughout the United States, that we all had his drawings at our desk as we were learning to draw.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I do want to return to drawing because it's essential to this discussion. David?
I would point out how important context is, I think, to Michael and how he teaches. Tony has talked about the context of history as a device in the studio, but it goes well beyond that. Michael often taught with someone else, and look at the people he taught with. He taught with Peter, he taught with Leon Creer, he taught with Michael Wormfeld, a whole range of people. And the projects that he did were usually projects where the context was pretty strong. My year, it was an edition at Dumbarton Oaks. The year before, it had been the Waterworks in Philadelphia. The beginning assignment he always gave was an addition to Gunnar Asplin's Villa Snellman. So the response to what was there already, and then being able to sort of work with that as well as with another point of view from another faculty member, he liked the richness of it all. I think that was what was clear. It was never about a reductive strategy. It was much more about sort of an all-embracing, encompassing idea of where design fits.
Great. I want to come back to that because those things are critical. But before we leave the early years of Princeton entirely, Tony, can you and also Peter talk a little bit more about the Jersey Corridor project, which fascinates me just as an example of kind of subversive urban planning on some level, and how inconceivable such a thing would be today, as you've said. How inconceivable, well, the schema, the party itself is inconceivable, but also the way in which it came to be through the school.
Well, Peter will talk to it, but all I can say is that it was, at the time, a very powerful architectonic and architectural response to the increasing division between planning and architecture. That the increasing division between planning and architecture shifted, which I think is also even more divided today.
Right.
It was data then, it's big data now.
Yeah.
And the question is, what does architecture do in that situation? And we had this book by Jean Gottman, which was Megalopolis, which provided a series of black blobs of extending size from Boston through to Washington, with New York at the center. And the question was, what was suburbia and urban structure going to do in the face of that rampant growth? Peter.
Right.
I think to introduce another bit of context that must color what we do, there was, out of the case group meeting, the first meeting when Colin and Vince and Venturi and the five architects, that's without John Haydick and Richard, Michael, and myself, there were about 20 of us that met first year twice at Princeton, then twice at MIT, then we were at University of Oregon, we had a teach-in, etc. But at the very beginning, the first meeting, Vince Scully and Venturi walked out, and they said, we don't want, this is European, this discussion, which was modeled on Team 10. We want to talk about American vernacular, right? And they resented Colin Rowe. Vince thought he was going to take over the youth of America and lead them to the promised land. And finding Colin, who was very much entrenched with many of us. And so there became this thing called the Cornell-Princeton axis and the Yale-Philadelphia axis, right? And there was then there was 5-on-5.
And the whites and the grays.
Whites and
so
the grays.
Yeah.
But there was really a polemical and ideological context, which I don't think exists anymore. And it was, I think, very real to all of us participating in it.
Sure.
And even the case group broke down into basically the five architects and meeting at MoMA because we wanted to show buildings. We didn't want to talk about strange ideas. I think Tony's correct that John Gottman's book, Megalopolis, really influenced that, put a frame on the scene. I doubt whether Michael and I would have ever done anything like that. In fact, I think the result shows that we were, by the time we were done, there's a letter that David Mohney showed me the other day where we were apologizing for what we were doing as we were cashing checks. And so I think we realized that it was a really harebrained idea.
Right.
But it was, and Michael and I would remember this, it was really a heady time for all of us, the students. I mean, describing last night what we did in '65 with Corbu.
Yes.
I mean, that was part of that spirit. I don't know how our families put up with it, but we were there. I mean, it's not like you show up today in New Haven maybe once a week, once every 2 or 3 weeks for other critics. We were at the school 10 hours a day, and we were seeing students. It was big time. And so there was a fervor among the students, and it wasn't just what was happening at Princeton. It was at Cornell, it was at Cooper, it was at MIT, Harvard. It was around.
So you think that was the time more than the passion of youth?
I would say it was the time.
Right.
There's an
David?
institutional context to this as well. Princeton was at the point of establishing architecture as its own school. It had been a department in with art history and fine arts and other things. And so there was this emphasis towards the idea of a professional school. So for a couple of junior faculty to have access to the president is pretty remarkable. And they did get extraordinary amounts of money. I've seen the budgets. They asked for much, much more than they got. I mean, they were asking for $300,000, and they were earning about $8,500. But the point was that there was I think the institution was imagining a different idea of what an architect's education could be, much more aligned with the sort of research-based, sponsored, project-based idea that you find in some of the sciences. That didn't quite work out. But the other point I would make
But it was a very radical idea to introduce into that context.
and there was support for it.
Yeah.
The other thing that's extraordinary about the Jersey corridors is the degree to which, at least at the beginning, they really thought it was real. So they were lecturing to the New Jersey Farm Bureau about doing this project. There's stories in the Princeton paper about presentations to the Rotary Club, Princeton architects spoiling for a fight over Jersey corridor project. It really was about getting it out there and making it public. Extraordinary.
I don't want to drift too far away from Michael's own work here, but I do have to ask you, what exactly was the Jersey Corridor Project? I mean, can you explain it in 2 sentences or something, what the plan scheme actually was?
The idea was to run a parallel urban development straddling Route 1 and the railroad, the
right.
train from New York to Philadelphia. Maybe it was Trenton to Newark. I mean, it was...
Brunswick to Trenton.
What?
New Brunswick to Trenton.
Was it New Brunswick to...
Yeah.
Okay, that's long enough,
That's
right?
long-
It was a straight run. Look,
I always thought it was from Boston to Washington. That was my drawing.
You have to understand, Paul.
Yeah.
Michael drew it. I wrote it. He drew it. I mean, again, we had this division of labor. Neither of us knew what the hell we were doing. I mean, I'm really happy to give Michael credit for that section because it's not one of my favorite drawings. It made Life magazine, though, which was, I mean, we made Life magazine. We made the cover of the Alumni News. I mean, we were sort of rising stars. Where the thing comes, and I think we ought to talk about where we get unstuck, because I think it's important that Michael and I did get unstuck for him and for me. I mean, I don't think the union, we were called by a philosophy professor, Arthur Zathmer. He was walking down McCosh Walk, and he asked one of our colleagues one day, "Who is this Eisenman Graves?" And
He would not make that mistake today.
and of course, this was, people knew us as Eisenman Graves. And what happened, which is a very violent story in a certain way, is that Arthur Drexler came down from MoMA with Thomas Maldonado, and he was taken down to the basement where they had this huge model of the linear city. And he said, I didn't know young architects were working on big urban projects. So he said, I want to have a show of urban projects in New York. And Michael and I said, we can organize it for you. So we got the people in the case group, Jack Robertson, Colin Rowe, Stan Anderson, Hank Millen, and we put together 4 teams. Bob Geddes came on the scene, and we went to a meeting with Arthur Drexler, who said he wanted to have Princeton's name. And when driving back, Michael and I were in the car with Geddes, and Geddes said, listen, guys, I want to tell you, we're going to use Princeton's name. I'm going to decide who's doing the project, right? And I turned to Bob, and this was the end, right? And I said, Bob, you don't understand. Arthur Drexler wants us, not Princeton. And very shortly later, I was starting the Institute in New York. And for the benefit of both of us, I think. I think that Michael was able to move into the kinds of, I mean, he was doing some great houses at the time. And I was able to begin something that, I invented out of whole cloth. And we still remain together in the 5 architects and, many projects. We, as David would say, we taught together in the 90s in the same studio. And we used to celebrate Christmas together and, whenever. New Year's Eve, we remained friends, even though we were in different paths. And I think it was important, that very moment, I would argue, one of the most important, that we were no longer Eisenman graves.
Right. Well, I think it's reasonable to say that Princeton was not big enough for both of you. And that ultimately,
Probably.
one of you had to go one way or another. Let's go back to the question of drawing, which is so critical not only to Michael's life, but in particular to his pedagogy. David, you're in charge of the development of an entirely new school that is named for Michael in New Jersey. Can you talk about that a little bit, and about the role of drawing and the extent to which Michael's pedagogy has influenced the way in which this new institution is being shaped?
Sure. Drawing was central to the way that Michael taught at Princeton, and that model of going through a lot of trace, but also to keep a sketchbook, to sort of being able to document the process, the ideas, all of that, I think, was critical to the time that I was there. As someone who's been involved with architectural education pretty closely for over a generation, I will tell you that the nature of the expectations are changing, and you, especially for the accreditation standards, you're getting more and more requirements that have to do with the business of architecture and the technology of representation and other things. And I felt for a while that what was getting squeezed out of that was design, and how it is that one really thinks about and learns about design. At the same time, there's a political movement to shorten the educational period, less cost to students, more efficiency in the universities. And the baby was being thrown out with the bathwater. And there's something very different, I think, about learning architecture when you're using your hand as opposed to a keyboard and a mouse. And it troubles me greatly to see some of my own students who can make beautiful renderings on the computer, but they really can't draw very well on their own. And something's missing. There needs to be a better synthesis of this. I was looking at, I think it was Architectural Records website and new project this week, and there was a beautiful rendering, but it looked like every other rendering. At some point, they all just start to look alike. And this is, I think, where drawing can come back in a really meaningful way to start to differentiate and distinguish what's really valuable at a deep level about architecture and how it relates to society.
Yeah. Tony?
I think there's drawing and drawing.
Right.
And I think that one of the powerful models that Michael presents is that he draws architecture.
Yeah.
And he draws architecture in plan, section, elevation, and he does it in different ways, but the line, whether there are too many or not, but the line is absolutely essential. And that comes from, I think, a deep study of the way in which I really do think Le Corbusier drew. He drew in 4 lines a space that is so powerful and so evocative, doesn't need a rendering, it doesn't need anything, it always has a human figure in it. In some way or another, drawing has been retained in architecture schools, and certainly in the architecture school where I've taught for a number of years, but it's been retained with an ideology, and it's been retained with a kind of a sidelined mission in terms of figure drawing and life drawing. But the drawing of architecture, the drawing of a space, the quick iteration of a plan and a section and the tracing and the redevelopment of that by the hand has almost disappeared. And I find that question, how you draw architecture, which is how you envisage it,
right,
and then how you can manipulate it, which is not something you can do actually in Grasshopper or Maya or in AutoCAD. You cannot envisage it in the same way.
Right. For Michael, it seemed as if drawing was always a way of seeing architecture and a way of teaching students how to see
it.
And absorbing it, internalizing it in a way that you cannot do otherwise. There's a gargantuan difference between technology as a tool for creation and technology as a tool for execution. And yet that division has somehow been blurred in education in the last few years, where it's just been thought of as something that can be used for anything, right?
I think it's important that architects draw. This is what we do. I know that we've been saying this for centuries, but I think it's important to reiterate it. architects draw. This is what we do.
Right.
We don't do anything else. It's also important to reiterate that design is drawing and drawing is design. You cannot design without drawing. For me, one of the pedagogies that we can learn from Michael is that the slice, the cut, is actually a misunderstanding. Plans are not cuts. Sections are not cuts. There is not some 3D object out there that we're slicing through. The plan is the analytical tool, the analytical drawing that allows you to imagine and construct and design the space. So the challenge that I see in architecture schools today is that by emphasizing the idea of a tool as a tool for design, we're actually divorcing the very fact that design and drawing are one and the same, that they are not separated. Drawing is not a tool for design. Drawing is design. So often I think that we somehow have reverted to the Middle Ages. You know, in the Middle Ages, the buildings were done by trades, and then models were constructed, and the trades will measure the model and then build a building around the model. The invention of architecture was that moment where a plan was cut, where a section was cut, so that no longer was this 3D model the generator, but actually the abstraction of the plan and the section was the guiding principle for construction. So I think that drawing, understood not as a 3D model, drawing understood in its abstraction is a powerful way of thinking about design that somehow we have in recent times with the excitement of digitization, we have somehow lost. But for me, it's not a hand versus digital. One can draw and design a very good plan digitally. So I don't think it's about which medium you're working through.
Okay.
It's about a lack of understanding of design as drawing and drawing as design.
Yeah. I think that's an essential point, although can one actually, if one is dealing only digitally, can one actually absorb what you're talking about? I think not, right? Yeah.
There's actually a different problem in my mind with the medium of the digital, and that is the lack of scale. But drawing through software is actually scaleless. You're drawing one-to-one, which is strange because the screen is much smaller than the human body. So it's not really one-to-one, it's actually scaleless. So for me, what is important about hand drawing is not just this idea of the relationship between the hand and the brain. We can argue about that. It's more the relationship in scale to the person that is actually designing. If you are designing in a particular scale, you include a set of information or exclude a set of information that actually allows you to think differently about the project.
I'd also say that the one thing that the hand does is it's much quicker than the screen. It takes my students, at least, a long time to produce a model or an iteration of any kind of projection. But it's instantaneous to go over a plan or a section or a three-dimensional sketch. I mean, when you look at the little sketches that Jim Sterling drew as he was drawing his plans of little 3D axonometrics of everything over and over again, he did those in 5 seconds, I mean, really quickly. And you can begin, the designing process is to do with the mind and the facility of the hand to follow that mind and to develop that mind.
Peter, yes, please.
Since Tony has brought in the mind, I was waiting for that incision because we all think, at least it seems that, Michael is this guy that, has a hand and that's it, and he can draw and paint, etc. We're talking about an incisive mind, to wit, just last week, I needed to find something out about the idea of diptych. And the only person I knew to call about that was Michael. And I said, Michael, can you give me a few examples? And within hours, I had 2 or 3 examples and beautifully articulated as to why they were there in the history of painting, the history of architecture. And as I remember Michael teaching, there were always books around. That we were looking at books on painting, looking at books on graphic work, whether they were 18th century, 19th century. And, you know, we've got to be careful that Michael is not just this noble savage with a big paw. I mean, he is a dedicated intellectual, and maybe not an academic, but certainly a person with an amazing knowledge that he brings to bear when he's drawing, not just for a student, but in projects. There's always a layering of many meanings in everything that he draws. That's because he knows the material, he studied the material, and he's educated himself, I mean, in an incredible way, from Cincinnati to Harvard to the American Academy to the many years that he would go back and forth to Europe. So I think you're talking about a unique teacher for studio. He doesn't give a course in Renaissance architecture. The course in Renaissance architecture is in the studio. Right. And I think that's an enormous resource that rarely do you find in the studio. I mean, studio projects are, you know, design a motel, and, you know, there are no references, or design a hotel. And Michael always brought to bear that with the talk about context and in those projects. And I think that's really, we don't want to lose that in the
right. I think that's absolutely, totally and completely correct and essential. Like I think Michael's fundamental sort of creative stance or drawing style, whatever one wants to call it, that sort of extraordinary synthesis of cubism and kind of mannerist classicism is something that could never have been created only by instinct. It also, right. it requires a kind of profound intellectual grasp of all of those things to be able to synthesize them in the way that he has for himself. And the fact that he's also communicated that so consistently to students is essential, I think.
So going back to your question about was it the time?
Yes.
Oh, right.
Yes.
What is it that has allowed for, or has generated, or has just why has precedent disappeared? I mean, is it to do with the technology the technologies of not only design but also of construction and development? Why is it that I go into studios, I teach studio. Mm-hmm. The students today are not interested in precedent. They will not, I mean, I will present precedent, I will draw precedent, and I come back the next day and there's a whole other culture of what quote-unquote architecture is. And it's not architecture in the same way that the generation of Sterling or the generation of Rossi understood architecture.
My sense, I'd like to hear what everyone else has to say about that, but my sense is that precedent has not so much disappeared for the majority of students, and for a minority, it's too present in the form of mimicking. So, I mean, where precedent comes in at all, it seems to be in those who choose to copy. The subtlety of synthesis and learning from something so as to be able to produce something else, but that's grounded in a knowledge of precedent, that's what you don't see very much of, I think, today.
That one of the debates that you see is between beauty, which is ongoing, and originality. That's mm-hmm. where you see, because what the students see today is originality. Everything has got to be new. I had a student ask me 2 weeks ago, I thought the purpose of coming here was to learn to be original, okay? And so therefore, in the kingdom of the original...
You said no, Rem, it's not.
Right. There's no precedent, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And it's very funny that I should come down on the side of beauty as opposed to originality in this world.
Irony of ironies,
yeah,
yes.
Irony of ironies. But it's true. I don't think that... I think that what they see, if you look at the heroes, if you look at Zaha's work, every week it's something different, more of the same but different. If you look at you know, Jean Nouvel. I mean, come on.
Yeah, but Peter, didn't people say that about Paul Rudolph too? Say, I mean, I'm not saying it is true of Rudolph, but did not people say that about him? And eventually, maybe it did come to be true.
It did come true. It became original, and it just kept changing. Early Rudolph, no. I mean, early Rudolph was quite extraordinary.
Right.
Early Zaha was amazing. You know, it's not what she is today. When somebody says at a conference at Yale last spring, this guy who makes chairs said, I can make 50,000 variations of this chair. And I think, you know, why would he want to do that? The first one is awful. Why do I need 50,000, variations of the damn thing? Choose one and get it right. So that's what the computer gives you. It gives you the parametric design gives you an infinite range of possibilities where no value judgments in terms of aesthetics or beauty enter in.
Let me put
Yeah,
this in
please,
the context
David,
of
yes.
the idea for this new school of architecture. I think images are so prevalent now, and they're so easy. And the kind of replication of images where you don't really even look at them anymore, the students don't. And I think what you could see in Francisco's presentation was the degree to which Michael really looked at the original objects. So for this school, I'm talk about what I call a first-person education, that the extraordinary resource we have is to be here in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan region with some extraordinary examples of good architecture. So the idea is to get the students out to look, to observe, to document, to analyze, to touch, to sense, to have a real appreciation in time, physically, sensorily, of what architecture is about, and bring that back to the studio, not just to look it up on a computer.
Right.
It's rather, as you said about scale, it's very rare that I find students actually inserting themselves in the representations or the different kinds of perspectival iterations that they develop in computation. The self, you can see that they've never walked through the space they've designed, either in imagination or in terms of actually tracing their steps. And that's the real problem, is one of the things that Michael always stressed was the body, and the verticality of the body, the horizontality of the body, the form of the body, and the relationship, as you said, tactile and projected to a space, and then the tactility of that space containing and allowing for that body to work. And that disappears all too easily in digital representation, in flat screen representation, and it completely disappears when you make your model in terms of digital.
Because also part of the body, part of the physicality of the body is the reality of seeing, and how one sees goes hand in hand with that, right, Peter?
Yeah, I want to go back to this. What is today, what was yesterday, and why I'm not convinced that David's wicket is possible today. I want to throw a caveat out. In the 1940s, there was an authority figure in American education. It was Frank Lloyd Wright. There was an authority, you knew Wright. In the 50s, it was Lou Kahn. In the 60s, it was Le Corbusier. In the 70s, it might have been Jim Sterling, etc. What we don't have is, and that's why draw what, all right? I mean, there is no authority figure today. There's a plethora of star architects, but no authority that says this is the way things should be. And I think this is difficult for students, and I don't think just drawing and precedents are going to solve this problem. I think there is no sense that there is a disciplinary attitude toward design that one could rely on as a buttress in a school situation, in a studio situation. The students are really at sea because the teachers, in a sense, are, what is the discourse? What is the project? Michael had a project when he was teaching. He taught Michael Graves. if you didn't, I mean, I know because I taught with him, and the students, I'd say, why are you doing Frank Gehry? Do Michael, you know, learn from Michael. And I think that master teachers have a project, and they are authority figures. I think they have to be, whether they are Zaha or Rem or Nouvelle or whatever. I don't think we have those authority figures teaching today in many, many places. And therefore, there's and I'd like to hear what my colleagues here think about that, because we don't, I mean, what do I teach? I teach Renaissance architecture because I don't know what else to teach today. You know, I've given up teaching Corbu because, you know, that's a dead issue. And, you know, then people will say, well, why should we know what Palladio did? A good question. I can't answer it.
Why should we know? Why is Corbu dead? I don't quite get why. I mean,
Modernism is, you know, Pilotti and the 5 points are, you know, pretty much, I mean, it's the last thing that got washed down the drain, you know. I mean, I think Palladio's a long way ago.
But
so.
Yeah, but do you?
Well, I mean,
can you teach Le Corbusier without teaching his ideology necessarily? I mean, I think you can, right?
Yeah, I mean, he teaches Palladio, I teach Corbusier, that's fine. I remember Raymond Abraham, when I first met him in Cooper, he said, oh, you're the guy. And I said, what guy? He said, you're the guy? He said, I was coming into this country behind this guy who took carefully out of his hand luggage a complete collection of Œuvres complètes. He said, I couldn't believe the guy carried an Œuvre complète in his hand luggage, right? And it was me, right? That's why I protected it when
when
Michael and
you brought it all the way
Michael and Peter ripped all their
ocean.
Œuvres complètes out.
Right,
yeah.
right.
But no, I think you can teach Corbusier as architect, as someone who transformed Palladio and who you can transform again. I mean, there is an authority in the way in which there's a whole set of transformations that you can begin to work on. Not mannerist transformations necessarily, but architectural apps. I think what we've lost is the sense of abstraction. I think, you know, modernism had a sense of abstraction which allowed you to look at the plates of Choisy and determine all architecture as having a kind of volume, a surface, and then you could manipulate plan, volume, and surface in ways that Corbusier did with Byzantium and Palladio, and the way which Palladio did with Byzantium and Bramante. So I think that's possible. We don't have a sense we have abstract drawings, right, in terms of digital iteration, but they are not abstract. They are very realistic in a certain kind of way. Those are numerically realistic.
How many teachers do you know that can teach Corbu because they haven't been taught it themselves? Yeah. How many people can do that today? I've not seen it. Yeah, good. I mean,
but I think Michael does teach in the way that Tony is talking, or did, right? I mean, right.
It was Michael.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But I mean, since he's given up teaching, let's say, or regularly, you know, whatever, I don't think there are people. I mean, the people that are teaching core at Yale, I don't know if they could teach that. I mean, Bob's here; he can talk about it. But I think that most of the teachers are interested in originality in most schools when you go around and see them. I don't know. Monica might be able to tell us.
Okay.
But I think everybody would agree that in order to be original, you need to understand the discipline, and you need to understand what happened before. How can you be original if you don't understand what's happened before? And I think every teacher today would agree. If you see them in the room, they would agree with this statement. In my opinion, in the last 10 years, architecture panicked. And when you look at the topics of discussion in school, for me, they fall into two camps. There are those that talk about somehow architecture saving the world. And the work that has come out of that camp, unfortunately, has actually been very amorphous. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have those who speak about technology saving architecture. And the work that has come out of that camp, I call supraformal, a lot of form. Form, like you say, the first one might not be so good, but they can do 50 variations of it. But I think we are coming to sort of this end of the era of panic. I actually think that among this formal rubble, one can begin to see jewels that are coming to the surface, where there is a recognition that the discipline of architecture has a history that is very robust and a history that is very much at the heart of the construction of culture. I think the panic came from a certain fear that maybe we're not culturally relevant, but when you see what is happening in society at large and the desire for design, the desire for a place, irregardless of technology, irregardless of the internet, I think that we are seeing, at least at Michigan, at least in all of the schools that I'm engaged with, you see a return to architecture as a powerful, meaningful, substantial form of culture. That doesn't need any saving.
Right.
That actually does not need to save anybody and doesn't need any saving. So actually, for me, where Michael's legacy is very vital today is in his unapologetic attitude throughout his career that architecture communicates not to classes, but to individuals. And of course, I'm quoting Calhoun here, but that thread through his work, where architecture is about architecture, and this actually has the power to communicate to individuals, as opposed to try to manipulate, or not manipulate, but as opposed to try to maneuver through social issues, for me is the biggest legacy, and the one that today is very relevant and very important because it can help us get out of this, what I call the rubble.
Yeah, David, please.
Can I weave another thread into this? And that's the role of Michael's practice, because we have a practice that is amazing in terms of its output. I mean, many hundreds of projects, hundreds if not thousands of objects of furniture, definitely thousands of designed objects. It's extraordinary. But I would argue, in fact, that the education and his work as a teacher is critical to the practice, and every bit the equal intellectually to him, I think, in how he carries out his work. So it's just a question, I think, of how you situate all of this in a meaningful way. But that one of the things we're missing, I think, is where there are the practitioners who have made that kind of commitment to education that Michael demonstrates.
Right. Let me go back to something Peter said a few minutes ago when you said, Michael Graves teaches Michael Graves, and explore that a little bit, because I think what you meant, or I hope what you meant, was Michael Graves teaches as only Michael Graves can do, not Michael Graves teaches you to be Michael Graves. And I think that's relevant to the discussion we've been having, because about whether great architects are in fact models or sources of things that you transform in your own way.
Both. I mean, I think Michael is both himself and the way he has transformed work. I mean, you cannot, in a Michael Graves studio, what's the point of doing a Frank Gehry project? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, because Michael can't teach, or I can't teach Frank Gehry. Nobody can teach that. So why do that, let's say? Why do Aldo Rossi? I mean, no matter how much there may be similarities in the Tuscan sense,
right.
But we're not talking about it. We're talking about certain compositional frames that Michael, we're not talking about style.
Okay, right.
I didn't mean style,
no, I know.
Michael. I mean compositional frames, the way he would approach a site, the way he would approach a symmetry and asymmetry. I mean, for example, I was put on to the idea of a diptych, which is a compositional frame, as opposed to binuclear. Now, Gropius and Breuer did binuclear houses, and Colin Rowe used to rail against them that they got the whole idea of the two wrong. The diptych, as Michael did in the Whitney, which is one of his great projects as far as I'm concerned, and is a sort of pinnacle of the idea of a diptych. Now, a diptych is a compositional frame. If Michael sets up a situation where a diptych is required and you produce a binuclear plan, then Michael would criticize you. Or if you produce, scribble scrabble and you know, no plan at all or no compositional frame, then it's useless to have Michael. Michael has a project which he can teach in a very particular way, and if you're a student, forget what you think. I mean, I've always cautioned students, and no matter who they're studying with, whether it's a Tom Beebe, whether, you know, it's the latest Greg Lynn, you know, you follow who the teacher is and not copy or imitate the teacher, but use the compositional frames.
Right.
And that's why actually Frank is a very good teacher, because that's what he does at Yale.
Yeah.
He gets kids to do things that they wouldn't normally do out in the compositional frame that he works in. Let's say the same with Greg Lynn when he teaches. So there are extraordinary teachers out there, but if the students insist on being original or their own way, they're going to miss it.
But your idea of composition relates to abstraction. And what modernism did to the Beaux-Arts was to abstract. The interesting thing about all the architects you've talked about, including Michael Graves, including Frank Gehry, is that they rely on the erasure of the literalism of the Beaux-Arts through abstraction. They still rely on Beaux-Arts composition and all the handbooks of composition in order to go against it, in order to transform it, in order to move it. And composition is precisely what you talked about in relationship to design. That is the organization of spatial narratives in relationship to the human occupation of space.
But another point that I want,
Please.
that's different, Tony, and you would agree. When there was a jury in 1970, let's say, the people on the jury spoke the same language. They could speak shorthand, let's say. They could address the student, because the student and the faculty and the visiting critics, et cetera, all were within an authority. That's what I was meaning by an authority. Today, you don't have that. There's no shorthand. The references are missing. In other words, if you ask a student, why did he or she do this, it's not referring back to a reference that then they can discuss. And so a lot of times it's a scattershot view of the world. And I maintain that the kind of juries that we had in the 60s, 70s, and 80s are probably not possible. Not that we don't have good students and good teachers. It's just that authority of a common discourse.
Well, the common discourse also, and you just mentioned to me a little while back, that the source of all this problem is Wikipedia. I mean, the common discourse is the common discourse which is lost, and I know it because I've just had a son go through the whole school system, including university graduation, and he has a huge difficulty, have gone best schools, best teaching, and so on, of any kind of sense of historical chronology, timeline, distance. I mean, he did fantastic projects on the history of chocolate, right? But it's at a certain point, the history of chocolate's not going to get you to the First World War, the Second World War, and after, right? I mean, but it doesn't give you that sense of the washing line that you need, or the red thread, as Tafuri would say, to hang your discourse on in relationship to time and space. And I found the scattershot, which is Wikipedia, basically. Scattershot is precisely how my young students, at least, are facing the world. It's tweet.
Is it a matter of attention span, too, and the inability to delve deeply into something, or
no?
not?
It's precisely because the authority of history, right, which was the authority. I mean, even the old, worn-out doctrines of the history of democracy, the rise of and fall of empires. At least you could object to it because it was a structure. It had an authority in the mind, and you could take empires. You could be against empires because they were, the English were pink all over the map and so on. But there was a geography and there was a history, which you were, to a certain extent, indoctrinated. You had to learn it. But at the same time, it was something there, like the Beaux-Arts, to react against. It was an authority which everybody knew and everybody critiqued. And I'm not sure we have that at the moment. We have a very, very different culture of event. It's an event culture as opposed to a moment culture as opposed to a narrative culture.
Yeah. I think,
Colin used to require of his students, parenthetically, not as a reading list, but he would quote de Tocqueville on America, right? He would quote Taine on America, and you'd have to pick up these books. Who was Hippolyte Taine, right? They all happened to be conservative voices, but the students certainly didn't know that. Certainly I didn't know that when I read it.
and it didn't have to be. I mean, I remember Scully used to bring in Mark Twain, Robert Lowell, all of that,
Yes.
and
That's right.
I was introduced to a lot of that stuff coming in around that way sometimes.
But I'm saying is that's also missing,
Right.
that kind of parallel discourse that allows the student to situate what he or she's doing.
But what I said, how then do you take an event culture and narrativize it and give it a structure which is not? So I start now with Tristram Shandy, right? I start with the novels of events, right, and how are the narratives of events taken up. Little spaces, little events, little narratives. I mean, I think it's not enough to sit and rail against what we've lost or how we were educated.
Are we doing that?
We're doing that, but I don't think that's enough. I think, to a certain extent, Michael and you are absolutely correct in starting a new school. Whatever happens to that new school, it's worth starting because it is something that wants to say or present an alternative to what is now, right? And I would say we have to do the same with our narratives, and the same with if we want to reintroduce composition, then maybe that's the wrong word and the wrong form to introduce it, but we have to find a way of reintroducing what we mean by composition in a way that's meaningful to our present cultures.
Isn't a lot of it the way our culture has so completely changed its concept of time, with everything happening faster and faster? I mean, narrative implies extended time, and today, nothing deals in extended time. I mean, maybe we need a slow architecture movement, like the slow food movement and things like that, actually, at this point.
But I think we're making a lot of assumptions about students. In my mind, every school can be a new school. And it's really about the faculty. So as I said, in the last 10 years, I think there has been a panic. And architects have stopped talking about architecture. Teachers have stopped talking about architecture. I teach the freshman seminar at Michigan, and we look only at precedents, and we look at them in, in a timeline. And the students are very happy to do this. It's an extremely popular course. They show up early, et cetera, et cetera. They're not against it. There's nothing in their high school education that somehow magically made them different than me when I was a freshman. So I do think that we have the power, and we're doing this, and there's many schools already doing what I'm describing. We have the power to return the conversation to architecture.
Good.
I think they are different. I think the media culture that they live in, the text messaging, tweeting, they are children of shorthand. Right. And as Tony said, event spacing and whatever. I don't think that they take what you give them in the same way they would have 10 years or 15 years ago. I mean, probably not. But I'm sure that I didn't take my education the same way that you took your education. True. I mean, there is always difference from generation to generation. But that doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't translate necessarily in us having to struggle to find new means. I think that the old means will find their way as well.
Some buildings are not worth more than 140 characters. Let's come. I'd like to leave some room for questions and to bring all of you into the conversation as well. Before we do, let's talk in a more general way about what you think Michael's legacy to pedagogy will be. Perhaps it will be in the new school that carries his name. What else will it be? I hope it will not only be in something the loss of which we are lamenting, but perhaps.
I mean, as I said before, I think that the insistence that those very specific, the very specific content of the discipline of architecture, its own history, being accessible to the individual without moral content, is, in my mind, is actually the beginning of the next chapter of architecture. And that's something that Michael has done consistently throughout his career. So this is what I see his contribution to pedagogy being very long-lasting.
Great.
The best definition for architecture, I think, is 2,000 years old, and it's Vitruvius, commodity, firmness, and delight. And for a lot of the last century, the architecture community focused on commodity and firmness and forgot about delight. And I think Michael sort of joyously puts delight back in there for the public. And there's a way for the public to come in to architecture that I think is critical. And unabashedly, he can put that into the teaching environment. So that's I think, significant.
Good. I think that's well said.
I think two things. I think one, I think what his legacy is will be. In other words, I think his legacy is to do with the vast and deep knowledge of architecture as a discipline and as real objects in real places, and the ability to abstract from them, draw them with that incisive mind.
Right.
But I also think that the legacy is already here. I mean, I think the fact that Peter dissimulates, he teaches Palladio not because he's given up on architecture and not because he's given up on the present generation. He teaches Palladio, well, first of all, he teaches Palladio to get back at Colin Rowe. Right? He probably learned Tyranny to get back at Colin Rowe in the first place because Colin Rowe said, "Why are you standing in front of that building worrying about all those planes?" But he's getting back at Colin Rowe because Colin Rowe didn't see that there were outhouses in the Palladian villa, and so hey, there's outhouses in the Palladian villa, which is a context, right? And probably viscerally is a memory of Michael Graves saying that the villa has a context in a landscape sometime, somewhere in their teaching together. So my sense is that we are all optimists. You know, we don't actually sit and rail against, but I do think it's impossible. It really is important. It was important in the 80s, it was important in the 90s with certain kind of theoretical questions emerging. It's important now with certain technological questions. It's really important to see the culture in which one is living and not try, and at the same time to propose ways of doing what one does, inevitably. And I think Michael has always done that.
Right.
I would change the title of the conference to Today is Prologue, because I think we're talking about Michael Graves, not past, but present, and I think we're talking about a legacy that's evolving forward, not out of the past. And I think this morning and afternoon are part of that legacy as it develops, as it will continue to grow. I think Michael doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about legacy. I think he thinks about getting the next job.
Right.
And Godspeed. So I would like to think that we are today a prologue, and I think you have, Monica, talked about that we're going forward in finding the new situation, and if Michael comes along with that, that's going to be part of his legacy. But I think there is a moment in time where going forward is coming. And what that's going to be is going to be, I think, very interesting. In other words, I met with a group of students who were looking at Yale and various schools, and I said, I'm interested in students who have a passion for architecture, this is what we do best here at Yale. We teach architecture. We're the only pure architectural school in the country. We don't do planning. We don't do interior design. And I want people who think that architecture is important in the future of this country, which I think it is. And if you think that way, it will take care of itself, the future and the past.
Let's, in the last few minutes, open the conversation to some of you. If there are some questions, I ask you to keep them brief if you can and not speeches. Yes, sir. And since we don't have a mic out there, please be as clear as you can. Sure. Okay. The question is, given Michael's emphasis on the body and physicality, as new schools evolve and as existing schools evolve, can you address specifically the importance of figure drawing within the context of drawing and architectural education?
In Lexington, we had a required figure drawing course for the first year students, and I thought it was extraordinarily resourceful. It opens up all kinds of discussions. And you know, one thing that has happened, I think, with this emphasis on originality is that the idea of proportion is rarely taught. It's implicit, but it's not really taught in a way that it was before. And that's a place where you can get at that. And so much of Michael's work, I think you could see in Francisco's illustrations, there's so many different redrawings of something, and so much of that is around the idea, I think, of proportion. And the human body is obviously the place where that starts. So yes, I'm in favor.
I took figure drawing when I was in school. It was very important to my own architectural education. I can't convince my faculty to make it a required course. So currently it's optional. I think that together with figure drawing, something else that is important is the notion of scale drawings. You can generate them in the computer, but at least print them to scale. So it's not just a relationship of the body to the drawing as you are actually drawing it, but also understanding in a review, how can you have a conversation about a building if you don't actually have a clear understanding of what size it is in relationship to the body. So both the notion that you understand the body in space, but also that you understand the space in the body.
Tony, you were actually somewhat critical, at least implicitly, of it earlier, in that I sense you were saying that sometimes figure drawing can be used as an excuse for avoiding architectural drawing.
I will agree with Monica, though, because in that sense, the placing of the figure in space and the understanding of one's body in space of all kinds, you know, that wonderful little perspective that Corbusier does in Rio, where somebody's sitting on the chair and looking out, and then the view gets closer and closer and closer, and the place of the view, right? That, I think, is absolutely essential. So I'm not for figure drawing just for figure drawing's sake. I'm for figure drawing as, again, it's a question of how you abstract your understanding of your body to place it in space and imagine the scale, the proportion, and the space that you're drawing.
Good. Any others? Yes. Well, the question is really about social issues and their relationship to pure architecture and architectural education, I think, yeah.
Of course, part of the panic, of course, is the massive intrusion since the 70s, but increasing today, of environmental panic, social panic. Those two panics have increased the pressures on architecture enormously. So, yes, you know, a kind of NGO in Mumbai providing small infrastructures. The Previ example in the 70s in Lima. Those have always been part of architecture, I think.
Right.
Both the smaller scale intervention and the larger scale intervention, infrastructure through to the provision of a toilet. The question is, somewhere in there, there's always design.
Right.
And that's what I think the panic of environmental data, the panic of social data, the kind of Mike Davis understanding of the world as a slum has forced ethical students, students who have a social conscience, and there are many, many, many of them, in a sense, to lose sight of how that toilet or how that infrastructure is also a part of a designed entity. And that's the loss which has been increasing since the Jersey Corridor project, in fact, of the relationship between big data, the megalopolitan structure, and architectural design, which can, as Le Corbusier said, be either in the telephone or in the Parthenon.
Well, there's also, is there not often a misconception that commodity firmness and delight are sort of a zero-sum calculation, and that the more you have of one, the less you have of, therefore, of the other, and that, in fact, in a situation such as the one that the student just described, where someone goes to India to do a project of great social urgency and necessity, because it is, in fact, fundamentally a project of commodity, therefore delight must be less relevant, right? Yeah. So, any others? We have time for one or two more quick questions, if there are. Yes, sir. I will repeat that part of the question. How the fuck could you be doing the linear city and thinking about that at the time of the Vietnam War and the world coming apart in the 60s? But of course, there was a great movement of architecture as, at least under the delusion that it would be, that it was in fact addressing some of these problems this way. Fallacious though that may be, was that not the thought?
But let's be very careful. I said it was a moment of ideology and of real debate. Venturi's book of '66, Complexity and Contradiction, and the Learning from Las Vegas show the poles apart of where architecture went in 6 years, from '66 to '72. When we were doing the linear city, don't forget it's before 65, 66, Venturi's book didn't exist. We were taking a position vis-a-vis the culture, and there's no question that, it's a position that I suppose Michael and I would still take. That's what's interesting about it. And we got booed off the stage at MIT for not having a social position. And we were ultimately against Bob Goodman and his people up at MIT. We knew we were walking into a hornet's nest because we still believed in architecture as a resource to deal with these kinds of, say, colonial issues. So you could say we had a wrong-headed belief, but we were very didactic and polemical about it. We were not out protesting the Vietnam War, I can tell you that. They were protesting on Makash Walk while we were sitting hanging up Corbu Complet. And unabashedly so, that we were in a very different situation, and you have to understand that there were we weren't bad guys because we weren't out protesting the Vietnam War. Not that I saw. And as a matter of fact, one of my clients was in 1968, spent a year in Hanoi, a Princeton professor who had hired me to do what he called a Chomsky house. So I couldn't have been that far right that a very ideologically left Princeton professor wanted a Chomsky house from me, who was also ideologically left.
I think it's important for everybody to realize that you guys make a separation between social responsibility.
For those who didn't hear,
I don't know.
You made a separation between social responsibility and architecture.
I wouldn't want to say that.
Yeah, right.
I mean,
but
I wouldn't want to say that we were interested in form primarily, but that doesn't mean we thought that we're irresponsible. So I don't want to see that dichotomy. always been a formalist, unabashedly so.
Right.
Michael, I would imagine, as well.
Right.
That's what links us. But
As one who only had a responsibility of developing the history of the linear city in the project, it seemed to me that from the start of linear cities in Spain in the 1890s, all the way through to project after project after project in Russia and elsewhere, they were all social projects. They all were projects of social responsibility. They were social responsibility because they were to do with protecting agrarian culture, they were protecting landscape culture, protecting the world from the endless sprawl of suburbs. They were communication devices, they were walking devices to transportation devices, and they were seriously socially responsible. Whether they were wrong-headed or not in terms of the form of that responsibility is another question, right? But we weren't... Working on the linear city didn't seem to me to be something completely divorced from either the social responsibility that an architect had to the American population, the social population of America, or the population that was being devastated by war in post-colonial wars. So I did not necessarily think so commodity, firmness, and delight were not necessarily zero-sum games, each one of them. They were all part of the process of being interested in architecture on the one hand and society as part of an architectural practice.
Which I think also, if you look at the full scope of Michael's practice, it underscores that very point. I mean, to the very important work that I'm glad Francesco showed at the end of what he's doing now, in the category of healthcare and accessibility, which is a sort of synthesis of all of the concerns he's had through his entire life coming together, but they've all always been there from the beginning to the end. I think our time is up. Thank you all very much, and please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you. Thank you. Great. Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful.